Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Christine Gibson as of a couple of months ago. And I posed the question that Rachel Naomi Remen asks in her beautiful book, how do we heal when cure is not possible? And as a family physician and trauma therapist, I feel like I'm a little bit qualified to speak to that. So I'm putting this as a little bit of my bio as well as some conflict of interest. Some of you may recognize that I've been speaking about my book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, in the hallway. And I've been a MAiD provider since the very first week of 2016 where it was legal in Canada. I was one of the only doctor of 400 hospital-based doctors where I was practicing at the time. So it was a challenge to have a lot of conscientious objectors in my site leadership, to be navigating not just buckets of paperwork, but also a lot of objectors within my hospital environment. So, of course, I, as many of you who are providers of medically assisted death, went into it because I wanted to alleviate suffering. And I recognize that this should be a human right and a part of medical care that I wanted to offer patients. So I became an early and passionate advocate. In fact, my very first provision, I created a network for him to meet a journalist that he gave a long-form essay about his choice and his life. It was called Life and How to Leave It. So advocate not just for my voice, but for patients' voices. But it took me some time to also recognize that there was some trauma inherent within this job, one of 4 jobs that I have. I work in refugee health and addiction health, and I didn't recognize, because I love alleviating the suffering of people requiring MAiD, that there was some pain. People were suffering so greatly that they were asking to die. That is a traumatic event, and that trauma affects them in very different ways. And I also didn't recognize that in bearing witness to that amount of suffering, I was also holding a lot of it in my body. And it wasn't until I started to, the formatting is quite different on their computer than mine. It wasn't until I started to recognize more about how trauma shows up in the body and how it might show up in my patients and myself that I recognized that it was potential within this practice. And some of this has to do with a person's background. So whether or not a person experiences the suffering related to MAiD as traumatic has to do with their childhood, both the adverse and positive childhood experiences. This is one of the illustrations in my book. And the way that it shows up in physicians and patients can be quite different. So it can show up like denial. So during that very first MAiD event that I did, I had a group of nurses who were keening loudly on the other side of the ward, and I had to pretend that that wasn't happening or I was not going to be able to function. It might show up as dissociation. So there's a certain song, you might know Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen, and I can't stop sobbing hysterically when that song comes on, and a lot of patients choose to have that play while they die. So I have to kind of hold back my tears, and I think about, well, am I gonna go walk the dog, or what recipe am I gonna do so I don't react to that song? It's just something that hits me. And sometimes I do get dysregulated. My father passed away in 2019, so that was kind of halfway through my MAiD journey. And there's certain people, like a sparkle in their blue eyes, that will bring me right back to the moment of his death, and I find my heart speeds up. And these are the ways that humans do handle and we cope with stress. These are natural ways that we cope, and sometimes those can get overwhelming. And our amygdalas within our nervous system send us down a path and say, oh, our mind-body is under some threat. What are you going to do about it? And sometimes that pathway, when it's locked on, it can actually amplify. So one of the things that I recognize now as a MAiD provider is that for people who've undergone significant trauma and they believe that their mind-body or their worldview is in danger, it amplifies their symptoms. And that helps me heal when cure is not possible. And some people have an ancestral lineage of trauma. So Indigenous patients, refugees that I work with, they're carrying trauma in their bones, and they don't necessarily have the language to understand or to describe and express what that feels like to them, but they do feel it. And one of the concepts that I wanted to share with you that's in the book, but I think it's important for us as MAiD providers, is to understand that window of tolerance. And a window of tolerance means that you can cope and handle what's in front of you. And when people are applying for MAiD, they're telling you, this is outside of my window, or I perceive that it's going to get there very soon. And the window of tolerance is something used in mental health, but I think it's equally applicable to MAiD. And how can we bring people back into that window as much as we can until they choose to fly through it? And what I like to describe to folks is the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth. Resilience is when you get back to your baseline, your status quo, and post-traumatic growth is when you are learning new tools so that you can learn how to swim. I think MAiD is one of those tools that we do provide people so that they can swim on their own and have more choice and control and flexibility. There are both cognitive and somatic, or brain-based and body-based interventions that can help people get back into their window of tolerance. And I believe that we as practitioners have a duty to help patients learn more tools so that they can spend more time in that window. And I honestly think we should learn more of these ourselves, because we sometimes suffer and the tools exist. So a couple that I'll share here for cognitive interventions might be something like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is encouraging people to understand the values that have always driven their life and how they can still live by their values even if they are disabled in a way. Internal family systems means that part of you might be scared as you contemplate your death, and part of you is really feeling relieved because you've been successfully applied and eligible for MAiD. And if you could ask each of those parts of you how they're feeling, what would they say? Some body-based therapies that I love to share with patients include havening, tapping, tremoring. All of these are chapters and videos attached to my book. Havening is a really beautiful way to just give yourself gentle self-touch, and it creates some delta and theta waves in the brain. And then I'll encourage people to invoke a favorite memory. We might have heard that psychedelics are really gaining good ground for evidence in improving existential fears and anxiety at end of life. So how do we heal when cure isn't possible? We recognize the trauma, we apply interventions that are available, and we aim for post-traumatic growth at all stages of life. This is a river of life exercise I sometimes do with patients when I'm doing my consultation. This can help the providers gain resilience, empathy, purpose, and wisdom. And I'll just share with you some of my practices. A poem that I do when I have a death that gives me some big feels. He gripped the can as it held an elixir, but in reality, it was a can of Budweiser. His crew came to visit in the morning, and it was the first time I'd ever met his boyfriend. And today he saw the foreman hug his boyfriend, and he felt the scaffolder gripping his hand, calluses bulging in his palm, and the other hand rested on his boyfriend's shoulder. And it was maybe worth death to feel this kind of peace. How to find me, and the dog that helps me regulate my emotions after a particularly challenging, traumatic MAiD event. We go for walks. Thank you very much.